By sunrise, 35 city blocks were ash, hundreds were dead. And for nearly 60 years, America barely admitted any of it happened. Not a footnote in a textbook. A massacre erased so completely that many people in Tulsa itself grew up never hearing its name. One man, Dick Rowland, had spent that night in a jail cell in Tulsa, Oklahoma, listening to a mob outside grow into something closer to an army. A few streets away, a black attorney named Buck Franklin had no idea that within hours, his own office would be burned to the ground, or that the account he was about to write by hand would take almost a century to be believed. How does a city forget its own atrocity? Not by accident, by decades of quiet, deliberate omission. And the story of how that happened, and how it eventually clawed its way back into the light, says something uncomfortable about who gets to decide what history remembers. Stay with this one, because by the end, you'll see physical evidence that historians only found using radar equipment buried under a city that spent a century pretending it wasn't there. Picture Greenwood in 1921. It wasn't just another neighborhood. It had its own hotels, its own movie theaters, its own newspapers, even its own hospital. Black families built all of this within a single generation, most of them only a few decades removed from slavery. Locals said a dollar could change hands more than 20 times inside Greenwood before it ever left the district. It was one of the most prosperous black communities in the entire country. And inside 18 hours, nearly all of it was gone. Families watched an entire generation of work disappear before lunch. The spark was almost absurdly small. Rowland, a black shoe shiner, stepped into an elevator operated by a white teenager named Sarah Page. What exactly happened in those few seconds has never been settled. Historians still debate whether he stumbled, whether she simply cried out in surprise, or whether nothing improper happened at all. Page herself later refused to press charges, but a local newspaper ran an inflammatory headline. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Black veterans of the First World War showed up armed, trying to stop a lynching they had every historical reason to fear. A single shot rang out. To this day, nobody has confirmed who fired it, but that's not the strangest part. What followed doesn't read like a riot in the usual sense. Spontaneous, chaotic, over quickly. The documentary evidence increasingly points to something closer to a coordinated assault. Deputized white men were handed weapons straight from the city armory. And then, according to survivor testimony collected decades later, witnesses looked up and saw something almost nobody expected. Private airplanes, circling overhead. Imagine hiding inside your own home and then hearing engines in the sky above you. Survivor testimony and later investigations describe those aircraft being used to observe residents, fire on them as they fled, and drop incendiary material onto rooftops, making it one of the earliest documented allegations of an aerial attack against American civilians on U.S. soil. Firefighters who tried to reach Greenwood were turned away at gunpoint. Here's where the story gets stranger still. The dead disappeared. Official records filed at the time listed as few as 36 victims, but the American Red Cross, which arrived to treat the wounded, quietly estimated the real number could be 10 times higher. For most of the century, nobody with any institutional power wanted that gap explained. City records went missing. Newspaper archives from those exact days were later found physically cut out, pages missing, as if someone had gone through with scissors. What survived instead were photographs, grainy, black and white images of smoldering storefronts and empty lots where a hospital once stood, filed away in private collections because no public archive wanted them. Families kept asking the same question for generations. Where did the bodies go? For 70 years, the answer they got back was silence, or worse, condescension. Survivors who described mass graves, bodies loaded onto trucks and driven off to be dumped, were told they were remembering it wrong. Old memories, embellished folklore. Would you have believed them? Many officials and investigators dismissed those accounts for decades. This is where evidence and legend genuinely split apart. It took until 1997 for Oklahoma to even convene a commission to investigate, and even then, it wasn't historians who forced the question. It was survivors, still telling the same story, decade after decade, until it simply couldn't be ignored anymore. Then the radar lit up. In October 2020, forensic anthropologists from the University of Oklahoma began excavating Oaklawn Cemetery using ground-penetrating radar based on testimony that had been dismissed for generations. They found a mass grave. By 2021, exhumations had recovered dozens of remains showing trauma consistent with gunfire, buried in plain wooden coffins, in patterns nothing like an ordinary cemetery. The excavations confirmed key parts of what survivors had been saying for decades, even as genetic testing continues, trying to connect the remains to living descendants. 100-year-old oral history, once written off as unreliable, had just been backed by hard science. There's one more piece of evidence that almost didn't survive at all, and it belongs to the man we met at the start. In the days after the massacre, Buck Franklin sat in a tent, his own office reduced to ash, and wrote a 10-page eyewitness account by hand. Planes overhead, smoke, bodies in the street. Plain, unembellished language, like a man documenting a crime scene rather than telling a story. Those handwritten pages disappeared into a family archive for almost a century. They resurfaced in 2015, donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where conservators had to stabilize paper that was already beginning to crumble. Franklin's own son, John Hope Franklin, became one of America's most respected historians, and for most of his career, even he couldn't get his father's account into the mainstream record he helped write. Imagine surviving something this horrific, then spending decades telling your children, because nobody else would tell it for you. Watching schools leave it out of every textbook. Watching insurance companies deny nearly every claim filed by burned-out families, citing a legal loophole for riot damage. Stacks of paperwork rejected, one after another, for a fire the families didn't start. Nobody was ever convicted for a single death. In 2021, the last 3 known survivors of the massacre, all over a century old, testified before Congress, not asking for sympathy, asking for a legal reckoning. Their case reached the Oklahoma Supreme Court, which dismissed it in June 2024, ruling the harm, however real, didn't fall within the state's narrow legal definition of an ongoing public nuisance. One of the 3, Hughes Van Ellis, had already died in 2023 at 102. Viola Fletcher, the last to testify publicly, died in November 2025 at 111, having spent over a century waiting for an admission the law never fully gave her, even as the ground beneath Tulsa had, by then, already confirmed so much of what she'd been saying all along. The paper record failed. The courts failed. The city failed. But memory didn't. For 75 years, grandparents kept telling the same story to grandchildren who had no reason to doubt them. The same way Buck Franklin's 10 handwritten pages waited nearly 100 years for someone to finally read them. Then the ground itself answered. It turns out history hadn't disappeared after all. It had simply been buried, waiting for someone willing to dig.